The girl vanished, walking her dog. 1 year later, a hunter's thermal drone captures this. The sun was just beginning to climb over the horizon, casting a soft golden light over the sleepy town of Lakeland, Idaho. Marissa Ewing stood at her front door, her fingers gripping the handle, watching as her daughter Adrienne slipped out with the family dog Buddy on their routine morning walk. It was a Saturday, the one morning a week, where Marissa allowed herself a few extra hours of sleep, knowing that Adrienne and Buddy would return before the morning could fully wake. But this time something was different. That walk would be the last time Marissa would see her daughter, the last time she would see Buddy, and the last time her world would be whole. Marissa didn't know it then, of course. The world, the routine, the comfort of knowing that her daughter was just down the street walking their loyal dog would all soon shatter. It started as a normal day, with no sign of the horrors that would soon unfold. As the minutes ticked by and the early morning grew quieter, Marissa felt the usual peace of Saturday mornings settling in. But as the hours passed and no sound of footsteps returned, a knot began to form in her stomach. Something wasn't right. The first few calls went unanswered. The texts, too. As the morning dragged on, the gnawing worry turned into something darker, something that didn't belong to a quiet town like Lakeland. By midday, her heart was in her throat. Adrienne and Buddy had never been gone this long. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Marissa dialed the police, and then she dialed again, and again. Her voice, calm on the outside, but breaking apart on the inside, informed the dispatcher of the situation. The police arrived within the hour. Marissa, still in her robe, tried to calm her racing thoughts, her mind flitting between the worst possibilities. Maybe they had simply gotten distracted, walked further than usual. Maybe the dog had run off after a squirrel and Adrienne was chasing after him. But the hours stretched on, and the police search turned up nothing. No Buddy, no Adrienne. For days the police combed the neighborhood. They checked the familiar trails that Adrienne and Buddy had walked for years, through the lush green of the nearby national park, and along the old logging roads that wound like veins through the forest. They spoke to neighbors, checked the woods, and questioned anyone who might have seen anything out of the ordinary. Nothing. But the town's unease grew. Where were they? What had happened? Adrienne had always been a strong, responsible young woman, careful, organized. She was the last person to wander off. But what if it wasn't a simple case of bad luck? What if something more sinister had happened? Days turned into weeks. Each day Marissa hoped, no prayed, that she would get the call, that someone would have found her daughter, that the nightmare would end. But the phone never rang. A year passed. A whole year without a single word from Adrienne. A year of unknowing, a year where every moment felt like a breath held in waiting. The community began to drift into the background of her mind, the searches dwindling. Police reports had gone cold, and the volunteers had stopped coming. The trail went cold. The faces that had once crowded her doorstep offering help slowly disappeared from her life. They had their own families to care for, their own lives to lead. It was just Marissa now, alone. Alone in the house where everything had once been whole. In the silence of that year, Marissa couldn't help but question everything she had ever believed. How could this happen? How could her daughter, simply vanish without a trace? And yet each day she rose from the bed, washed her face, and faced the world that had been irreparably changed by this incomprehensible absence. Then came the day, a day Marissa would never forget. It wasn't the day that the police called. It wasn't the day the search ended, or even the day her daughter was found, because that day hadn't come yet. But it was the day when everything changed. It was an early spring morning when the phone rang. It was Detective Marcus Holbrook, a name that had become so familiar to her by now. His voice, calm but tinged with something she couldn't quite place, was the first sign of hope in a long while. "Mrs. Ewing, we've received an unexpected lead." Marissa's heart jumped into her throat. It was a lead. It had been a year of silence, but now a lead. She barely allowed herself to breathe as she replied, "What is it? What have you found?" The detective's voice held a new weight to it, a gravity that she hadn't heard in his words before. A hunter, Dale Morrison, was out in the Coeur National Forest early this morning. He was tracking elk with his thermal drone. He picked up a heat signature that didn't match any known animals in the area. He thought it was a coyote at first, but when he zoomed in, there was a pause, and Marissa could hear the quiet rustling of papers on the other end of the line. Then slowly the detective continued. "It was Buddy, your dog, Mrs. Ewing. We've located him. He's alive." Marissa's breath caught in her throat. Alive? Buddy was alive. It couldn't be. It had been a year. A whole year since Adrienne and Buddy had gone missing. How could Buddy have survived? Where was Adrienne? Was she still alive too? Her voice shook as she demanded, "Where is he? Where is my dog, and Adrienne, is she with him?" Holbrook's voice was steady. "We've sent a team. The dog has been rescued. He's at the Northern Idaho Emergency Veterinary Clinic. He's alive, Mrs. Ewing. We're still mobilizing the search teams, but we need you to come in, and we'll bring you there. We don't know where Adrienne is yet, but this is the strongest lead we've had in over a year." Marissa's legs nearly buckled beneath her, but somehow she managed to stay upright. Her mind raced as she pushed herself into action, grabbing her jacket, rushing out the door, and driving to the clinic, her mind whirling with a mix of dread and the faintest glimmer of hope. Could it be true? Was there still a chance to find her daughter? Was this the break they had been praying for? In the next moments, Marissa would learn the truth that would unravel everything she thought she knew about her daughter's disappearance. Marissa's heart pounded in her chest as the car engine hummed, taking her down the winding roads toward the Northern Idaho Emergency Veterinary Clinic. It had been over a year since she had heard any news, and now a single phone call had thrown her into a whirlwind of emotions. Hope, fear, and dread mixed together, crashing inside her like a wave. As she drove, her mind raced with questions. How had Buddy survived? He was a dog after all, and not even the toughest dog could endure the harsh elements of the forest for a year without food, water, or shelter. And where was Adrienne? Why hadn't the search teams found her? Was it possible? Was it really possible that her daughter was still alive? It seemed inconceivable. But Buddy had made it. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the barren road. Marissa's thoughts were a tangled mess, and she gripped the steering wheel tighter as she approached the clinic. The building was small, but there was a sense of urgency in the air. The familiar smell of antiseptic hit her the moment she entered through the automatic doors. She rushed to the reception desk, her hands shaking. "Mrs. Ewing," the receptionist said softly, recognizing her immediately. "Dr. Sarah Chen is expecting you. Follow me." The woman's face was kind, but Marissa barely noticed. All she could think about was Buddy, her loyal companion, who had been with Adrienne since she was a child. Buddy, who had been by her side through thick and thin, was still alive. But where was Adrienne? The door to the examination room opened, and Marissa's breath caught in her throat. There on the examination table lay Buddy. His fur was matted and disheveled, his once golden coat now dull and thin. His body was frail, but his eyes, those familiar kind eyes, looked up at her. For a moment time seemed to slow. Marissa stood frozen in the doorway, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "Mrs. Ewing, Dr. Chen said, gently stepping aside. "He's sedated right now. We're just keeping him calm while we run some tests. But he's going to be okay." Marissa's legs almost gave out beneath her as she walked toward the table. Her hand trembled as she reached out to touch Buddy's fur. He was warm, breathing, alive. How is this possible?" Marissa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's been gone for over a year. How could he have survived?" Dr. Chen gave her a puzzled look. "It's remarkable, Mrs. Ewing. Despite the obvious trauma, Buddy shows clear signs of regular feeding over the past year. We found recent food in his stomach, dry dog food, probably within the last 12 hours. His body condition is relatively good, all things considered. Someone's definitely been caring for him." The words hit Marissa like a punch to the gut. Someone had been caring for Buddy, but what about Adrienne? Why hadn't the person who had taken Buddy, if they had taken him, helped her daughter too? The questions flooded her mind like a torrent. "What do you mean, cared for him?" Marissa asked, her voice trembling. "How?" "Why, I think it's best if you see for yourself," Dr. Chen replied. "It's an unusual case. But for now, we've kept Buddy here for observation. We're still running tests, but physically he's going to recover." Marissa nodded, her eyes never leaving Buddy's face. She had so many questions. How had someone managed to hide him for a year? Why keep him alive? But the biggest question of all remained unanswered. Where was Adrienne? The ride to the clinic had been a blur, but the ride back was different. Marissa's mind raced with the possibilities. Could it be that someone had taken Adrienne, just like they had taken Buddy? Could they still be alive? As she pulled into her driveway, the phone rang. It was Principal Janet Morrison, her voice laced with urgency. "Marissa, I just heard the news from the police department. We're organizing volunteer search parties to sweep the forest area where Buddy was found. The whole Lakeland High School community wants to help." Marissa listened numbly as Janet continued. The entire school was mobilizing teachers and parents coming together to search for Adrienne. It was the first time in a long while that Marissa felt a spark of hope. Her house quickly transformed into a command center. Volunteers filled the kitchen, and maps of the Coeur d'Alene National Forest covered the table. Coach Rodriguez, the head football coach at Lakeland High, took charge of organizing the search teams. Marissa tried to focus on the task at hand, but her mind kept drifting back to the same question: where was her daughter? Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, another unsettling feeling crept into her thoughts. There was something about Mr. Tobias Chandler, Adrienne's AP biology teacher, that seemed off. He had volunteered to lead one of the search teams, but something in the way he acted, the way he spoke about Adrienne, felt too familiar. It didn't sit right with her. Tobias Chandler was a well-respected teacher in the community. He had always been friendly, even going above and beyond to help students with their studies. But when he spoke of Adrienne, it was as if he knew her better than any other teacher had the right to. He seemed to have an intimate knowledge of Adrienne's personal life, her struggles with perfectionism, her worries about medical school, her fears about disappointing Marissa. He spoke of their private tutoring sessions, and Marissa couldn't help but notice how often he seemed to steer conversations toward Adrienne's weaknesses, as if he were feeding off her vulnerabilities. And now here he was, organizing the search, taking charge, directing people with military precision. But Marissa couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this. Had he been involved in Adrienne's disappearance? She couldn't put her finger on it, but every instinct in her screamed that something was wrong. The conversation at the kitchen table only deepened her unease. Tobias had offered to lead a search team in the eastern quadrant of the forest, an area Marissa knew well. But there was something about the way he insisted that made her suspicious. Was it a coincidence that this area was also where Buddy had been found? She couldn't be sure, but she knew she had to follow her instincts. She watched as Tobias meticulously organized his team, handing out supplies and checking their gear. His confidence was unsettling. It was as though he had planned this all along. He was too prepared, too calm, too perfect. Marissa found herself growing more and more uneasy as she watched him. She had to know more. Something wasn't right, and she needed answers. Marissa made a decision. She couldn't stay at home waiting for Tobias to lead the search, while Adrienne's whereabouts remained a mystery. She had to follow him. She had to see for herself. It wasn't long before Marissa got into her car and followed Tobias. She kept her distance, not wanting to be seen, but she had to know where he was going. Her heart raced as she watched him turn onto Rimrock Road, a street she recognized but hadn't been down in years. Tobias's car continued to wind through the rural landscape, the road growing narrower and more desolate with each turn. Marissa stayed behind, watching through her rear-view mirror as he pulled into an abandoned fruit stand. He stopped there for a full minute, just sitting in his car, looking around nervously. Marissa's breath hitched. Was he waiting for someone? Was he trying to shake off a tail? She parked a few hundred yards down the road, hidden behind a small cluster of pine trees, watching his every move. He finally pulled out, continuing south on Rimrock, but Marissa had seen enough. She had to know where he was going. What she would find next would change everything. Marissa's pulse quickened as Tobias's silver Honda continued down the winding rural roads, disappearing into the thick expanse of trees. She kept a steady distance, her eyes fixed on his car as it turned a corner, fading from sight. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened. She wasn't sure what she was expecting to find, but her instincts screamed that Tobias Chandler wasn't just a teacher. He was hiding something. Her thoughts raced as she drove, trying to make sense of the pieces of the puzzle. The strange behavior at the kitchen table, his oddly intimate knowledge of Adrienne's life, his insistence on leading the search, and now this driving in the opposite direction of where the search party had been planned. Every fiber of her being told her that she was getting closer to the truth. But what truth? What had Tobias done? Where was Adrienne? The silence in her car was deafening as she followed him further into the countryside. They passed empty fields, quiet farms, and stretches of dense woods. The houses here were scattered, set far apart from each other, and the roads twisted in ways that only locals knew. Marissa was an outsider here, but she didn't care. She had to follow. She had to know what Tobias was up to. After what felt like an eternity of driving, Tobias finally slowed his car and turned into a gravel driveway. Marissa had to act quickly. She pulled over a few hundred yards down the road, parking her car behind a cluster of thick brush. Through the trees, she could just make out the outline of the house, a large, old craftsman-style home, mostly hidden by overgrown trees and shrubs. It was the kind of house that had been standing for decades, maybe even over a century. But there was something unsettling about the place. It looked too well maintained for its age, as if someone had been keeping up appearances while staying hidden from view. Marissa couldn't explain why, but something in her gut twisted as she watched Tobias's car park near the garage. He stepped out carrying a key and disappeared into the house. He didn't seem to look around, his movements deliberate and calm. Marissa waited for what felt like an eternity. Her eyes never left the house, scanning for any sign of movement. There was none. No lights, no people, no activity, just the eerie quiet of the rural landscape. She pulled out her phone and with trembling hands quickly searched for the address she had seen on the mailbox, 4847 Rimrock Road. The result was chilling. It belonged to Tobias's grandmother, Eleanor Chandler, who had passed away in 2019. Tobias had inherited the property, and it had been listed as a rental property in early 2020, only to be taken off the market just weeks before Adrienne's disappearance. Marissa's heart sank. What did this mean? Why had Tobias suddenly decided to remove the property from the market and take it off the rental listings just days before Adrienne went missing? Could this house be where Adrienne was being kept? Could he have hidden her here? The walls inside the house, hidden from the world, might have been the perfect place to keep her out of sight. Marissa didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. But the more she thought about it, the less logical everything seemed. She decided to follow her instincts and get a closer look. After parking behind the barn, she carefully made her way toward the house, her breath shallow, her heart pounding in her chest. The property was large, and the house was set back from the road, partially concealed by trees. Marissa moved carefully through the forest, staying low and out of sight. She didn't know if Tobias was aware of her presence, but she had to be sure. If Adrienne was inside, she needed to know. The back of the house came into view. The basement windows caught her attention. Most of them had been replaced with glass blocks, a strange modification that made the area feel even more isolated. But there was one small window, a ventilation gap, partially covered by curtains. As she crept closer, Marissa pressed her face against the glass, her breath fogging up the window. What she saw froze her in place. The room inside was unlike any room she expected. It was a small, converted root cellar with stone walls that looked as though they hadn't been touched in decades. But now, it had been transformed. It looked like a classroom, a desk with textbooks stacked neatly on it, a whiteboard covered in writing, and a chair, with Adrienne's purple backpack hanging from it. The backpack, the one with the small rip on the front pocket, was unmistakably hers. She had taken that bag with her on the morning she vanished, the one Adrienne had used for school. Marissa's heart stopped. She could feel the ground slipping from beneath her feet. This was it. This was where her daughter had been kept. The room was cramped and dimly lit, but it was clear enough. The textbooks were from Lakeland High School. Marissa could see the AP biology text that Adrienne had used. And there on the whiteboard was something else: notes on cellular respiration, written in the same precise handwriting as Mr. Chandler's. This wasn't just a room where Adrienne was being held. It was a twisted classroom, a place where Tobias Chandler had kept her isolated, feeding her false beliefs that education was the only thing that mattered. Marissa's breath caught in her throat as Tobias's voice drifted up from the basement. He had brought food, a tray of sandwiches, milk, and apple slices, the same snacks that Adrienne loved. Marissa's hands were shaking as she pressed her ear against the window, trying to hear more. She could hear Tobias's voice clearly now, speaking with a tone that sent chills down her spine. "I brought lunch turkey and Swiss," your favorite, Tobias said. "You know your mom still hasn't figured it out, but she will. Eventually, she'll understand that I'm the only one who truly cares about you." Marissa recoiled. Her heart felt like it had been ripped out of her chest. Adrienne was down there alive, but trapped, and Tobias had been manipulating her for months. The words Tobias was saying were chilling. He had convinced Adrienne that her mother wouldn't want her back, that she had to stay hidden to avoid the outside world. He had used her love of education, her need for approval, to bind her to him. Marissa's chest tightened. Her daughter had been isolated for a year, deprived of everything that made her who she was. All for what Tobias's deluded need to control her, to make her believe that only through his guidance could she succeed. "You're going to be just fine," Adrienne, Tobias continued. "You're going to graduate with perfect scores, and you'll get into medical school. You'll make everyone proud, especially your mother. Once you've made it, she'll understand. She'll see that I did this for you." The words felt like a slap to Marissa's face. Adrienne had been under his control, manipulated, and coerced into believing that this was her path to success. Marissa's hands trembled as she clenched her fists. She couldn't stand it any longer. She had to act. If Adrienne was down there, if she was alive, Marissa had to get her out. But before she could make a move, the door to the basement slammed open. Tobias had come up. He looked around, scanning the yard. His gaze swept over the area, and for the briefest moment, their eyes met. Marissa's stomach dropped. The jig was up. Tobias knew she was there. Marissa's breath caught in her throat as Tobias's gaze locked onto hers. His eyes, once calm and collected, now radiated pure fury. The moment was almost surreal, her entire world narrowing down to this one horrifying confrontation. She could hear her heartbeat thudding in her ears, drowning out everything else. Tobias had seen her. For a moment, neither of them moved. Marissa's feet felt frozen to the ground, but the urgency of the situation snapped her into motion. Tobias didn't wait for her to make a move. He started charging toward her, his body tense, his eyes blazing with a mix of panic and rage. He was already too close. There was no time left to retreat. Marissa turned her body, reacting on instinct. She bolted toward the thick brush that surrounded the property, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear anything else. She could hear Tobias's footsteps behind her, fast, determined. She could feel the panic rising in her chest, but she pushed it down, focusing all her energy on escaping. Her mind was racing. She had to reach her car. She had to call for help. Adrienne was in that basement alive, but trapped, and she was running out of time. Her foot caught on a tree root, and she stumbled, falling hard against the earth. The impact sent a jolt of pain through her body, but there was no time to react. She scrambled to her feet, her hands scrabbling for purchase on the rough ground. She heard Tobias's breath just behind her, and a sickening jolt of fear struck her heart. He was so close. She couldn't outrun him in the woods, not with the branches and uneven terrain, but her car was close. She just had to get to it. The sound of his footsteps grew louder, but she kept running, her body screaming from the exertion. The clearing ahead came into view. There, just ahead, her car parked in the distance, the keys already in her pocket. With every ounce of strength, Marissa surged forward, her legs burning, her lungs screaming for air. She could see the edge of the woods, the open road, and her car, her lifeline. She had almost made it, but then she heard it. The unmistakable sound of Tobias's boots crashing through the forest behind her. He was still coming. Her fingers brushed the door handle as she dove into the car, slamming the door shut behind her. She quickly locked the doors, her hands shaking so badly she could barely manage to insert the key into the ignition. As she started the car, her eyes locked onto Tobias, who was now standing just outside her window, his face twisted in a maddened snarl. "You can't leave me," he growled through the glass. "I did this for you. You don't understand. She doesn't understand. She can't leave." Marissa didn't respond. There was no time for words, not now. Her foot hit the accelerator, the tires screeching as she drove backward, trying to put as much distance between herself and Tobias as possible. The sound of his shouting faded as she spun the wheel and raced toward the road, but she knew he wasn't far behind. As Marissa tore through the winding roads, her thoughts were consumed with fear for Adrienne. Tobias had taken her. For a year he had kept her isolated, feeding her lies, manipulating her into believing that she needed him for her success. And now, after all this time, she was so close. She could feel Adrienne's presence in the air, as if she were already on the other side of the car, just out of reach. The adrenaline kept her focused, but she couldn't escape the gnawing worry in the back of her mind. Tobias was still chasing her. She glanced in her rearview mirror, her hands white-knuckling the steering wheel. Tobias's silver Honda was following closely, tailing her, with the same intensity he had shown earlier. He was relentless. Marissa's heart raced faster as she navigated the corners of Rimrock Road. The town was ahead, and if she could just make it to the police station, she would be safe. The streets were starting to fill with more cars, and the distraction from traffic worked in her favor. Marissa could weave between the slower vehicles, but Tobias's Honda remained behind her, cutting off other cars determined not to lose her. She took a hard right onto the main road, her tires screeching as she sped through the intersection. She dared a glance at the mirror again, and Tobias was still there, following her like a shadow. Panic surged in her chest. He wasn't going to stop. He wasn't going to let her get away. She turned sharply down another residential street, pushing her car to its limits. Tobias's car followed every turn, staying right on her tail. She had to think. She needed a plan. As the town grew closer, she had an idea. The Walmart parking lot, large, open, and usually crowded, could provide her with the cover she needed. She pulled into the parking lot, slipping her car between two large trucks to hide. She couldn't risk Tobias spotting her. For what felt like an eternity, Marissa sat in the car, trembling. Her heart was still racing, but the worst of the chase was behind her. Tobias had passed the parking lot a few moments earlier, and she hoped he hadn't seen her. He was still out there, but she was one step ahead for now. Marissa's phone buzzed, and she jumped, her heart nearly stopping. It was a message from the dispatcher. "We have police units in position. Help is on the way. Stay where you are." Marissa exhaled a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. The cavalry was coming. Minutes later, her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from the police officer she had spoken to earlier. "The suspect is on his way back to the property. Officers have him in their sights." Marissa knew that the end of this nightmare was near. Tobias wouldn't be able to escape, not now. The law would catch him. Her heart swelled with a strange sense of relief as she watched Tobias's silver Honda pull into the driveway of the house she had just escaped from. The officers had arrived just in time. They had surrounded the property, blocking all possible exits. Tobias attempted to back out of the driveway, but it was too late. The police had him cornered. Marissa's hands trembled, but she forced herself to watch. This was the moment that would end his reign of terror. The moment when Adrienne would finally be free. Within seconds, the officers had Tobias out of the car, handcuffed and on the ground. He was shouting, still trying to explain, but it didn't matter. It was over. When the police entered the house, they didn't waste any time. Marissa, still shaking, followed them inside, her heart in her throat. They went straight to the basement, where they found the door hidden behind a water heater. It had been carefully disguised to keep prying eyes out. The officers broke through the lock and found Adrienne sitting at a desk with a notebook clutched tightly in her hands. She was thin, pale, but alive. She looked up at them, her eyes clouded with confusion. Marissa's legs nearly gave out as she rushed into the room, tears pouring down her face. "Adrienne," she whispered. "Adrienne, you're safe. You're home." Her daughter looked at her, her voice small and uncertain. "Mom, what's going on? I have to finish my assignment. Mr. C said I have to." Marissa's heart shattered. Adrienne's mind had been so warped, so broken by Tobias's manipulation, that she didn't even recognize what had happened to her. But she was safe now. That's all that mattered. The months that followed were a blur of recovery. Marissa stayed close to Adrienne, supporting her every step of the way as she dealt with the trauma. The road ahead would be long, but Adrienne was no longer a prisoner. Marissa made sure her daughter knew that no amount of academic success could ever define her. Love, safety, and freedom, those were the true measures of worth. Tobias Chandler was arrested and charged with multiple crimes, including kidnapping and abuse. His carefully constructed world had collapsed, and he would face the consequences of his actions. But for Marissa, there was only one thing that mattered now. Her daughter was home, and for the first time in over a year, Marissa felt the weight in her heart lift, replaced by the hope that Adrienne could finally heal. The days after Adrienne's rescue felt like a strange limbo. Marissa's house was filled with a quiet that hadn't been there in over a year. No more frantic searches, no more unanswered phone calls, no more missing pieces in the puzzle. But the relief Marissa felt was tempered by the long road ahead. Adrienne was home, but the scars, physical and emotional, were deep. And Marissa knew that healing was going to take time. Adrienne spent most of her first week back home, locked in her room, surrounded by textbooks, notebooks, and the remnants of the life Tobias had built for her. Marissa watched from the hallway, her heart aching for the girl who had once been so full of life, now trapped in a shell of her former self. The house felt different now, quieter, but not in a peaceful way. There was a heaviness that lingered, a silence where words could not quite fill the gaps. Adrienne had begun speaking more, but it was clear that her mind was still caught in the web Tobias had woven. She often muttered about her assignments, her perfect grades, and the fear that her future was now uncertain. It broke Marissa's heart every time she heard it. "Mom, do you think I ruined everything?" Adrienne asked one afternoon, her voice barely above a whisper as she sat at the kitchen table. She clutched her pen tightly, eyes fixed on a textbook, as if she could still somehow escape into her studies. Marissa sat down beside her, putting a hand on her daughter's trembling one. "No, sweetie. You didn't ruin anything. You didn't do anything wrong. None of this is your fault. I just want to go back to school, finish my work, get everything back on track. Mr. C said I was going to be so far ahead. He said I could do it." Adrienne murmured, her voice a soft mix of confusion and desperation. Marissa took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She knew Adrienne had to face this new reality, but it was hard. "You're not behind, Adrienne. You've been through something no one should ever go through, and now you're home. That's all that matters. You can heal. We can heal." Over the next few weeks, Marissa made sure to get Adrienne into therapy. Dr. Helena Morrison, the trauma specialist, who had worked with Adrienne in the hospital, helped her begin to unravel the psychological damage Tobias had inflicted. Adrienne's journey wasn't going to be quick or easy. Every session seemed to unlock new layers of pain, but slowly Adrienne began to speak about her experience in a way that Marissa hadn't expected. She had become aware of how much Tobias had manipulated her, and the realization was both freeing and painful. "It's like I wasn't even me anymore." Adrienne confessed one afternoon, after a long therapy session, I was just living in his world, doing whatever he said because I thought it was the only way I could make him proud. Marissa's heart shattered. The guilt Adrienne carried, the weight of thinking she had disappointed her mother, was unbearable. You were never meant to carry that burden, sweetheart. You were supposed to live your life, not be his prisoner. You did nothing wrong. As the weeks passed, Marissa worked hard to reintroduce Adrienne to the world outside the walls she had been trapped in. They spent time together, walking through the park, visiting Adrienne's old friends, and allowing her to rediscover the life she had almost forgotten. Meanwhile, Tobias Chandler's trial was beginning to take shape. The case against him was strong. His confession, the evidence found in his home, and the testimony from Adrienne were damning. He was facing charges of kidnapping, emotional abuse, and a slew of other crimes. But even with all the evidence against him, Marissa knew that the pain of the past year would never truly go away. The man who had stolen her daughter's innocence would soon face justice, but it couldn't erase what had been taken. The community was shaken by the revelation of Tobias's actions. Many had admired him as a teacher, trusted him to guide their children, and had no idea of the darkness that lurked behind his carefully constructed persona. Marissa, too, had never suspected that he was capable of such manipulation. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than anything she had imagined. Months passed, and while the healing process was slow, Adrienne began to find pieces of herself again. She no longer obsessed over her grades, and though she still struggled with self-worth, there was a new spark in her eyes, an ember of resilience that had not been there before. Marissa knew it was going to take time for Adrienne to truly heal, but she had her daughter back, and that was a gift she would never take for granted. Together they began to rebuild their lives, step by step, moment by moment. They would not let the shadows of the past define them. The future, though uncertain, was theirs to take back. As for Tobias Chandler, his life would be forever changed. The community had turned its back on him, and his once promising career as a teacher was in ruins. The court sentenced him to life in prison, where he would spend the rest of his days paying for the crimes he had committed. Marissa stood in the courtroom during the sentencing, her heart cold and distant. It wasn't that she wanted vengeance, it was that the justice system had done its job. But no sentence could ever undo the damage Tobias had done. His life had been taken, but her daughter's was still in the process of being put back together. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the final verdict. Marissa didn't feel a sense of relief, only a deep, resounding emptiness. It was over. But the journey of recovery would continue, and she would never stop fighting for Adrienne's future. Marissa sat on the porch one evening, watching the sunset with Adrienne by her side. They had come so far, and while the road ahead would always be filled with challenges, Marissa knew that as long as they had each other, they could face anything. Mom, Adrienne asked softly, her voice hesitant, "Do you think I can still make it to college? I mean, even with everything that happened?" Marissa smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached her eyes. "Of course, sweetie. You can do anything, and I'll be right here every step of the way." And as the stars began to twinkle above them, Marissa realized that while the past year had stolen so much, it had also given her something priceless, the chance to rebuild, to love, and to hold her daughter close as they created a new chapter together. The nightmare was over, but the story of their resilience, their strength, and their healing had only just begun.